Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to introduce Dr. Roger Squires, who probably needs no introduction whatsoever because I feel sure that his reputation comes before him. And he's going to talk about the Stratford and Avon canals, which is something different from any canals that might be anywhere near Stratford in London. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Roger, and Roger will regale us with the story of the Stratford-on-Avon canals. Roger.
Thank you very much, Martin. Good evening to everybody. Just to remind you where we are going this evening, in effect, the Stratford canals start here at Kings Norton Junction, go down to Kingswood and Lapworth Junction, and then go down to Stratford-on-Avon. The canals effectively were built in two parts, and the Marsh was stolen by the Grand Junction Canal, which they linked into at Kingswood. The story this evening starts on the northern Stratford at a place called Kings Norton. And this was where the canal effectively was started in November 1793. It linked into the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, and it didn't get to Stratford until 1816. The complete canal was 25.5 miles long, cost nearly 300,000 to build, and had 56 locks, a tunnel, and various aqueducts. The chronology of the Stratford-on-Avon Canal is best described in the chart that hopefully you can see on your screen. The initial act authorising construction was in 1793. As always, they had to make some changes, and the major change was to link into the Warwick and Birmingham Canal at Kingswood, and they got a further act in 1795 to do that. The canal, unfortunately, was not built easily, and by 1796, they got from the junction of the Worcester and Birmingham Canal through to Hockley Heath. And they finally got to Lapworth on the 24th of May, 1802. The next stage, which we call the Southern Stratford, was to open the canal through to Wootton Wawen in July 1813. As you see, it took quite a long time to get that far. And then it finally got through to Stratford on the 24th of June, 1816. The canal started off without a railway interference, but of course the railways came into this area. And what was most interesting was that when the railways took over the canal, they actually installed a water point to put water in the tanks of the locos underneath the Headstone Aqueduct. And here you can see in the centre of the picture the link from the bottom of the canal to a tap that the engine driver could open and put the pipe into the water tank on the loco. There were probably a few boiled fish about, but that didn't matter because the sort of strainers invariably took them out. But this is one of the only places I know of where there was a railway water point which was fed by a canal. The canal opened and then started to develop coal traffic, and it reached a peak in 1838. As always, canals were starting to be taken over by the railways, and in 1856 the canal was sold to the Oxford, Worcester and Wolverhampton Railway Company. And in 1865, the ownership passed to the Great Western Railway Company. And then in 1948, the ownership passed to the state on the nationalisation of the railways because it was a railway canal. The railway canal was left derelict from virtually the beginning of the Second World War, and there were noticeably three problems on it. There was a lift bridge at King's Norton, Lifford Lane lift bridge, and that got broken. And the only way that could be open was for the railway workmen to come in, bodily jack the bridge up and put sleepers underneath it so that boats could get past. As you will appreciate, the British Transport Commission at the time were not keen to do that. However, when the Inland Waterways Association was formed, it was decided in 1946 that they would try and pick some of the easy wins. And Tom Rolt put in an application to the British Transport Commission for Lifford Lane Bridge to be lifted so that his boat Cressy could go underneath it. This was the beginning of a series of campaigns that the Inland Waterways Association started to wage around the country. They saw that the derelict state of the southern section of the Stratford Canal was another one that might be picked off easily, and they started to campaign to try and protect that line, although it was pretty weed filled at that time in 1946. And of course, the IWA were beginning to send out explorations where Tom Rolt, Aikman and others started to go round the country to look at the state of the waterways. The first campaign that they decided to wage was in May 1947, when they decided to campaign to get the Lifford Lane Bridge, which had been fixed down, into a liftable position. The answer was that they put in an application for Cressy to go through the northern Stratford, and that meant Lifford Lane Bridge being lifted. The British Transport Commission at the time decided that they would lift the bridge on due notice, and they would send their own boat through to make sure that the track was clear. Unfortunately, the boat called Butser didn't get very far and got jammed in various bridge holes. And in the end, Cressy was allowed to go forward in front of it and move on towards the Lifford Lane lift bridge. The Lifford Lane Bridge was lifted up on sleepers, as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side. It was jacked up, and it was jacked up sufficiently to enable Cressy to get underneath it. Although, as you see from the left-hand picture, they had to quickly move the bike off the roof. The amazing thing was that crowds turned up to see Cressy go through Lifford Lane Bridge in May 1947, and this was the start of the process of getting the lift bridge repaired. The way in which they did this was to sort of continue the campaigns through the IWA, but then started a local group of enthusiasts, the Stratford Canal Club, which was formed in 1956 into the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society. The next blow to the IWA was in 1958 on the 12th of June, when Warwickshire County Council applied for an act of abandonment of the southern section of the Stratford Canal. The IWA realised that they had to prove that the canal was capable of being used, even though there were some quite substantial barriers on it. And they ultimately managed to get a series of canoe tickets to canoe down the southern section of the Stratford. And they did this in 1958. They were able to use the canoe tickets to show that the canal was being, quotes, used. And when a notification of a warrant for abandonment came up, they were able to put forward the canoe tickets as justification that the canal was being used and therefore shouldn't be abandoned. It was lucky that the chairman of the National Trust, a man called John Smith, was very interested in inland waterways, and he was willing to offer an olive branch to the British Transport Commission to take over the southern Stratford Canal, and he arranged this through the National Trust to formally take over the southern section of the canal on the 29th of September 1960. Once the National Trust had taken it over, they were able to authorise work to start on restoring the canal. The problem was, who should they get to coordinate that work? There was a young architect in the Coventry City Architects Department called David Hutchins, and he had a boat moored just outside of Coventry, and he was very interested in canals and indicated that he was going to lead a National Trust sponsored restoration of the southern Stratford Canal. So the National Trust took over the southern Stratford Canal in 1960 and then authorised David Hutchins to start work with volunteers and a couple of paid men to reopen the canal in 1961. By 1964, 3 years later, the canal was ready for reopening, and the various connections through John Smith of the National Trust gave the opportunity for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, to come along to declare the southern Stratford Canal open in 1964. The canal, as you see in the picture on the screen, in 1956 was a reed-filled ditch. It was very difficult to discern where the edge of the towpath was and where the canal began. And of course, the first major problem was to try and get rid of the various reed beds that had been created over time. David Hutchins was very adept at getting work done and went to Winston Green Prison to say, have you got a few inmates who want to do a decent day's work? If they would like to come out to work on the Southern Stratford Canal, I'll make sure they are given a decent day's work. And sure enough, the inmates from Winston Green Prison were allowed out on furlough and started work in clearing the canal. The problem was not simply to remove reeds from the canal, but also to get water back in some sections of the canal. The lock gates had deteriorated in many places quite substantially, and even down in Stratford itself, the basin was filled with mud. And as you can see from the two pictures on the screen, the problems of clearing the canal, sometimes from blocks of ice and other times from mud, were the major problem that David Hutchins was confronted with. David Hutchins, who you see on the left, took up residence in a cottage alongside the waterway, and the chairman of the Restoration Trust was Robert Aikman, who you see in the right-hand side picture below. These two men worked quite well. Robert was not a technical man, and he simply said, over to you, David, you get on with the job and leave me to deal with the politics. Because Robert Aikman was quite well connected with John Smith of the National Trust and was able to persuade various donors to give money towards the restoration project. The run up to the restoration was very intense, as you can appreciate. The 30th of July was the critical date in 1956 when that protection committee was formed, and that later became the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society. In 1957, society members surveyed the canal and prepared a restoration report for David Hutchins. Also, two members of the Canal Society bought canoe tickets and traversed the canal where they could, and used those canoe tickets to prove that the waterway was being used. This meant that when in February 1957, when Warwick County Council proposed the abandonment of the Southern Stratford Canal, rather than repairing a road bridge at Wilmcote, they were able to say, sorry, sunshine, you can't do that. The canal is in use. There was a protest meeting organised by the Friends of the Stratford Canal, the Canal Society members, in February 1957, in April 1958, at Stratford Town Hall, and the meeting all unanimously agreed that the canal must be restored. The question was, who would restore it? David Hutchins was ready at the starting blocks to get going, but he needed the various authorities. John Smith, who was chairman of the National Trust, expressed an interest in the trust taking over the canal, and in June 1958, the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society produced their restoration plans. It was fortunate that in July 1958, the Bowes report was published by the government and identified the principle of canals should be treated in the most most economic way. And David Hutchins was able to show through the various figures that he put together that the most economic treatment for the southern Stratford would be to restore it. British Transport Commission, however, decided that they wanted to press ahead with abandonment and posted a notice at various points along the canal in August 1958. Surprise, surprise, 6,111 valid objections were collected, and the canoe trip tickets were submitted to prove that the canal was wanted and should not be abandoned. With this ammunition behind him, John Smith of the National Trust opened negotiations with the British Transport Commission for the National Trust to take over the canal. And in October 1958, the National Trust Board agreed to that principle of acquisition. On the 28th of February 1959, the Canal Society was given permission for preliminary clearance work on the channel. As you saw from the early picture, it was very much weed clearance. In May 1959, official confirmation came out of the failure for the warrant of abandonment by the British Transport Commission. And on the 17th of November 1959, the National Trust and the British Transport Commission signed an agreement for the transfer of the canal to the National Trust. The National Trust immediately appointed their willing volunteer, David Hutchins, as canal manager, installed him in one of their houses in the Lapworth area, and he was able on the 1st of March 1961 to start the restoration project. He identified that it could be done in 3.5 years and effectively committed himself to doing it in that time. Many people said he was probably overambitious, but the point was that he actually got on with the job, took shortcuts where possible, and managed to get the restoration work done. And the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, agreed to come to a reopening of the canal on the 14th of July 1964. The southern section of the Stratford was the one that the National Trust took over, and that linked into the northern Stratford at the bottom of the 16 lock flights at Kingswood Junction. And that's where the junction is with the Grand Junction Canal. And then the canal strides off through the Warwickshire countryside through to a place called Wilmcote, where the escarpment leads down to the valley of the Avon. And here there was a major lock flight of 11 locks going down from Wilmcote. So we had a series of individual locks down to Lawson Ford, and then 2 or 3 batches of locks at Yarningdale and Preston Baggat, and then one other lock at Headstone, Wootton Wowen area, and then the major flight of locks from Wilmcote down the escarpment to Stratford. The point was that some parts of the canal were quite passable, and here you can see the canal two canoes with permits going along Headstone Aqueduct, which was pretty clear of water, of reed at that time. The problem was that when they got down to the outskirts of Wilmcote, the bridge there had to be propped up because it was in a parlour state. But as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side, the two canoes were able to get under the beams that were supporting the bridge, and the canoes were able to continue on their journey. The main aim of the National Trust was to get the public on their side. And they put up a notice down at the side of the basin at Stratford on Avon, where they claimed it costs more to close a canal than to reopen it. And this is where they put their costs on the board and indicated that they needed volunteers for work to come along to get the canal restored. The volunteers came forward, but there were never sufficient volunteers for David Hutchins, and this was why he approached the governor of Winston Green Prison to get a supply of co-opted willing volunteers to do the work. And this meant that he was able to get the work underway. Many of the locks were in a parlour state, and to a greater or lesser extent needed to be restored, with the brickwork in the upper locks being repaired. But on the Wilmcote flight, 2 or 3 locks had to virtually be rebuilt. And this was one of the aqueducts in the right-hand picture, which had to be cleaned out and the silt got out, and the whole process of rejuvenating the canal got underway. The problem was that those reeds had collected silt, and David Hutchins was a dab hand with a drag line, and he managed to procure a second-hand drag line crane and was able to use it with great efficiency in clearing the mud and silt and reeds from the channel. But of course, not everything could be done by dragline, and the volunteers had to come in and, as you see in the right-hand picture, had to go down into the canal itself to dig out small trees and plant roots and the like. The work on the various locks continued all the way down the line. David Hutchins was very good at marshalling resources. He identified the need for bywashes to go in, as you see, one being going in on the left-hand picture. And he himself started work on restoring some of the brickwork on the locks. If you look at the right-hand picture very carefully, there is a man with an ordinary cloth cap, and that is David Hutchins, seemingly taking the powers of gravity into his own hands by standing on a plank whilst he worked on refitting bricks into the wall of the canal. David Hutchins was a man who led by example. He wasn't afraid of hard work and was always willing to take the hardest jobs himself. This meant that volunteers were quite willing to come out and work hard on the canal. The problem was that it was rather more than hard work. It was a daunting task, particularly on the flight of locks going down from Wilmcote into Stratford, where various coping stones and brickwork had been pushed into the canal itself, as you can see on the right-hand picture. But all of these tasks were within the realms of opportunity for volunteers, with little bucket cranes pulling out the rubble which the volunteers carefully placed in those buckets. The point was that David Hutchins tried to look for ways in getting the work done efficiently. Stratford-on-Avon is quite near to 2 or 3 army camps, and one of those army camps was run by the Royal Engineers. And David Hutchins found out that the Royal Engineers on their site had a dragline crane, and he saw this as the golden opportunity to dredge out the silt-filled Bancroft Basin. And he used the engineers' pumps to pump out a lot of the rubbish that was in the canal by sucking out the mud from the lock chambers themselves. So by judicious use of Royal Engineers kit and Royal Engineers work parties, the basin at Bancroft in Stratford-on-Avon was cleared, and the various locks were drained and the mud and silt removed. And then all of the gates had to be restored, and the Royal Engineers cranes came in quite handy for this work as well. The aim of the game was to get the canal opened or reopened in 3.5 years. And David Hutchins realised that you had to prove the point. So he got a local trip boat from the northern Stratford to come down to test the depth of the southern Stratford Canal. And this you see doing so in the left-hand picture. He also tried to develop public support. So there were various proposals made for boats to converge on Stratford-on-Avon. And here you see 2 narrowboats that travelled 335 miles in 36 days to get to the opening in Stratford. It was all part of a public relations campaign to get the public on side. Another part of the public relations campaign was to have a boat come through the canal in a particular publicised opening campaign. And on the left-hand picture, you see Laughing Water, which was the boat chosen to do that. And in the right-hand picture, you see the boats that conglomerated in Stratford to prepare for the grand opening on the 11th of July. The 11th of July was the ideal opportunity for the Queen Mother to come along, and you see her, see her in the picture in the lock at Stratford, coming off the River Avon, where she was able to declare the basin and the restored canal open. This was a major coup because the endorsement of the Queen Mother for the reopening was a sign that, you know, this was the way forward for the future. The reopening of the canal, it was overall, the northern Stratford was open, but the southern Stratford had to be reopened. It was about 13 miles long and required a large operation to get those locks restored. The actual cash flow was looking at donations made in kind through the labour of the volunteers and from the prisoners of Winston Green Jail, and had the National Trust not been able to utilise those prisoners, they were able to reduce the cost of restoring the canal by half, nearly, from 7,500 per mile to 3,500 per mile. The canal actually required considerable dredging. Quite a large number of lock gates had to be restored, but when you actually look at the speed at which David Hutchins worked, nearly the bottom line on the screen, the average time to demolish and virtually rebuild a lock in the Wilmcote flight was 16 days. It was quite an amazing feat by David Hutchins. So we had a new stage for the southern Stratford and the northern Stratford canal when the canal was taken over by the British Waterways from the National Trust in 1988. And the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society celebrated 25 years since its reopening in 1989. The Canal Society marked the millennium by erecting mileposts for the full length of the restored Southern Stratford Canal, and the Society celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2004. And and celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2006. As with all the waterways, the management was taken over by the Canal and River Trust, and here we are today. The Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society were able to muster a canoe trip for a large number of canoes to go down the canal in 2017 to mark the 50th anniversary of the two canoes that went down to get the tickets to save the canal. And here you see the guy here is Clive Henderson, the chairman of the Waterways board is there, and various others were there in the front row with the mass flotilla going down the canal to mark the 50th anniversary of the canoe trips that saved the canal. The Southern Stratford Canal, as I mentioned earlier, in the northern section, you have the northern Stratford coming down to Kingswood Junction. And apart from the Lifford Lane Bridge and a little bit of dredging, that was kept open. it was the section from Kingswood Junction down to Stratford that was restored. And that was opened by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The locks in the upper section are invariably spaced out. There are a couple of closely spaced locks at Yarningdale and Preston Baggat, and then you have the Wilmcote flight of locks that go down the escarpment towards Stratford. And this was the canal that was initially taken over by the National Trust and then taken over by the British Waterways Board and later the Canal and River Trust. The canal, as you see here, is heavily locked, the northern section down to Kingswood. And then from Kingswood Junction, where there is a link canal into the Grand Union, the canal goes out towards the countryside at Lawson Ford and then down towards Yarningdale. And it was this section of canal that the volunteers got opened fairly quickly. The junction here has been modified when a new link line was put in to enable boats to get into the southern Stratford without wasting water through the top lock. But for the most part, the canal really is, in this picture, one of three canals. You had the heavily locked northern Stratford coming down to Lapworth Junction. You had the Grand Union or Grand Junction Canal going down towards Warwick. And then you had the southern Stratford here and the extra link line put in to enable water saving to take place. The canal effectively was one of various unique features. The southern Stratford was built with these split bridges to enable the tow ropes to be passed underneath the bridges without taking it off the boat. And you get a very good example at Kingswood Junction. The line over on the left of the picture goes into the Grand Union, and this is the southern Stratford going down here on the right-hand side of the picture. And the distance post here pointing out Kings Norton up the northern Stratford and Stratford down this way. The just beside the top lock is an interesting feature, and that has now been converted into the British Waterways maintenance space for the area, with the various old buildings that were part of the Stratford Canal taken over and modified for modern purposes. But here you can see how neat the top lock is on the southern Stratford and how neat that maintenance yard is. The new cut was built through the promontory of land to enable water to come out from the Grand Junction Canal in below the first lock of the Stratford-on-Avon Canal, so that boats didn't have to go through a lock up to come down a lock. And therefore you had enough water saving device. But here is an example of one of the first of the many barrel roof cottages that were built along the southern Stratford Canal. The barrel roof cottages were so named by the sloping roof that it was purported to have used the timber formers for bridge building to make the roof. And there is a little sign at Kingswood Junction that repeats this story. The point is that the features of the canal that make it quite unique are these split bridges. Split bridges, of course, are used in various other places, but they were particularly used on the southern Stratford to enable boaters to take the tow rope straight through the split in between the two cantilevered halves of the bridge. And that was to assist the boaters going down the southern Stratford Canal. The split bridges abound on the waterway, and some are on accommodation bridges, and some are actually on crossover bridges for the towpath. This is bridge 38, and as you can see, the split is quite clear. Once you get going down the southern Stratford Canal, there are three features that catch your eye. Firstly, you see the mileposts that go alongside the route of the canal towpath, and these identify the mileage from Kings Norton Junction, and they were put in by the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society. Secondly, many of the accommodation bridges have these wonderful splits in to enable the towpath to go through. And of course, many of the accommodation bridges were built near to the locks that you can see in this picture. The canal was operated with various personnel living in lock cottages that were built especially for the canal personnel. The canal cottages were built initially with barrel roofs, but over the years, some of them have been modified quite substantially to give extra accommodation for the current residents of those cottages. But the barrel roof is still a feature of many of the cottages as you work your way down the canal. And here you see a very good example of a barrel roof and how an extension has been put in. All the way down the canal are various information boards that have been put in by British Waterways to identify the key features along the waterway itself. The canal is now crossed by the motorway, but many of the locks still have pedestrian bridges across them. And the right-hand picture shows how the pedestrian bridge has been built in to the end of the lock to enable boaters to work their way down the flight and get across if they want to get to a footpath on the other side. The bridge that you see in the left-hand picture is the Motorway Bridge that came in substantially later. Perhaps one of the nicest of the lock cottages is the one at Rowington, and this has not been, well, it has been modified, but not had a major modification. And it means that you can get a feel of the character of the Lock cottages that used to provide the means for the staff to look after the locks and control the water supply down the canal. The locks were built in part without bywashes, and one of the major tasks for the restoration work were to put in a number of bywashes to enable the water supply for the flights of locks to be contained. As you can see from the right-hand picture, quite a bit of bank erosion has taken place over the years, and this means that you have to be careful taking a boat down not to get too near to those wooden posts. The locks, of course, are all narrow locks, and most of them have got over bridges at one end or the other, which means that it is a good opportunity to dip the towpath underneath the overbridge and allow it to continue on down the side of the waterway. The next major point on the waterway is Lawson Ford, and here there is quite a remarkable hostelry that has been upgraded over the years, the Fleur-De-Lis. And this is, in normal years, absolutely a mecca for people to come down and watch the boats on the waterway. The last couple of years, unfortunately, have meant that not a lot of people have got to that point. So here is the Fleur-De-Lis inn, and it's got a very good restaurant in it. But by the lock at Lawson Ford is quite a good example of the barrel roof cottage and the little storeroom for the lock keeper at the side of it. These barrel roof cottages are in various states of repair, but the one at Lawson Ford is particularly well maintained. And here you see another picture of it alongside the lock with the extension on the outside for storage. As you come down the canal, there are various workboats that you see with lock gates on them ready to go in for the winter stoppage, or more particularly ready to take away the debris that is dredged out from the bottom of the canal. The canal continues very much through the countryside, and at Claverdon you are really out in the countryside, as you can see from the right-hand picture. But it's nice that you see on the boats that are moored along the waterway, people have got potted plants out on the foredecks to try and make their boats more attractive. At Claverden Lock, a little sign tells you that it's 15 miles from King's Norton Junction, and the lock here has got an overbridge which takes the towpath over from one side to the other. And you can see on the side of the lock the bywash that is has been put in to ensure the water supply is maintained for the main flight below. Claverden Lock is a useful example because you've got the split overbridge just at the end of the lock, and this is where you could pull the tow rope through the split as the boat came out of the lock. And this is, of course, where the towpath moves from one side to the other. The waterway is very nicely maintained now, but if you go down in the spring or in the autumn, it tends to be a little bit muddy on the towpath. The first aqueduct that you come to on the southern Stratford, working down from Kingswood Junction, is Yarningdale Aqueduct. And this provides a very simplistic example of how the aqueduct is created. You have the metal trough, and then you have a subsidiary towpath at the bottom level to get you over the little stream here. So you go over that and you get to the Yarningdale Lock and the Lock Cottage, which when these photographs were taken 2 years ago was under restoration. The towpath for the most part is good around the locks and good near to roads, but once you get into the rural situation, the towpath is not so good. Here you see below Yarningdale Lock how the bywash comes out beside it, and here you see a boat, one of the hire boats going through the lock. The locks have been carefully repaired over the years. When David Hutchins did his initial restoration, it was a quick and dirty job, and many of the locks needed further substantial work over the years after that original restoration. But for the most part, the canal is in pretty good condition now and is well used by the hire boats, which you see in the picture below. The aim of the game is to work down the canal, and here you see we've reached Preston Baggat, and this is where there are 2 or 3 locks and a major road bridge crossing over. And then you go out into the countryside through to the Anglo-Welsh yard at Wootton, where the basin has been converted into a marina. And there is quite an interesting aqueduct here that takes the canal over the road. The Yarningdale section is quite interesting. The split bridge here has been, unfortunately, the split filled in, but it could be reopened again if necessary. But as you say, the little bridges are quite closely aligned to the locks themselves and enable the towpath to cross from one side to the other. The Canal Lock here was built in 1810, and the Lock Cottage was put up at that time. But the Lock Cottage, like so many of them, was extended to provide better accommodation, and it was extended in 1989. But here you can see the sort of towpath, the split bridge, and the lock itself. The barrel roof Lock Cottage here is very neat, is looked after well by the owner, has got some equipment outside which is of interest, but more particularly provides the opportunity for the gardens of the alongside the lock to be maintained. The next section is at Preston Baggat, and this is where a road crosses the canal. The canal doesn't have a large number of road crossings along it, and therefore where there are road crossings, very often there are parking opportunities for cars so that people can go out walking along the towpath. But at Preston Baggat, the road, the local road, crosses over on a diagonal bridge, and below the lock is another split bridge, Bridge 49. And that is that split bridge. And here you can really see the way in which the engineering worked out. All along the canal, there are these marker posts that tell you how far you are from Kings Norton Junction, now at 17 miles, and they were put in by the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society. And then you continue on through the countryside, and it is very much out into the countryside, and the boaters who hire from the various yards, like Anglo-Welsh and the like, really have a very enjoyable run down a winding waterway which keeps you on your toes. The point is that there is always something to see, from the various split bridges to the various places where water comes in at the side of the canal. And then near to Wootton Wawen, there is a little basin and a marina, and this is where Anglo-Welsh have their hire boats based. The area here is quite interesting because the canal goes over a main road on an aqueduct, and the Anglo-Welsh marina is up at the high level just above that aqueduct. And this is where you see from the map that there is a little branch line that comes down from Hamney on Arden and links in with the branch line that comes down from Warwick, and the two link in together at Brearley Cross. The point here is, of course, that the canal, for the most part, is way out in the countryside. But the Wootton Wawen moorings are very substantial. There is a large basin here, and there is the Anglo-Welsh hire fleet using part of that basin. And then there are other moorings alongside it. In the winter, if the Anglo-Welsh people want to do some maintenance work on the stern gear of their boats, they lift them up on this little crane that has been built over the line of the canal. And that just shows how you can multifunction some of the features. Again, the Wootton Wawen Aqueduct has this lower level of towpath, so the towpath is level with the bottom of the aqueduct. And here you see the stop planks on the side, and there is a little reminder that the Stratford Canal was built by the company in 1813, and this is the names of the engineers who erected the aqueduct at that time. The canal, for the most part, is quite interesting insofar as you've got all of these features along it. That is the boatyard base. That is the little crane to do work on the stern gear and to put the stop planks in for the aqueduct. And here you see the low level of the towpath going across the bottom of the aqueduct. And here is one of the many substantial signs that have been put in by British Waterways to identify the key features along the line. And there are some quite nice graphics that you can see alongside that sign. And this is one of the ways in which the Southern Stratford is such an interesting canal. The Transport Trust noted the fact that the aqueduct here is a very substantial structure, and it's one of the longer canal aqueducts in England, and the Transport Trust put in a heritage site marker board, and here you can see the Headstone Aqueduct coming across the valley, and the railway line goes underneath it and a road goes underneath it, as well as taking the waterway over all of them. The Headstone Aqueduct has got a little marker board beside it, which tells you you're 25 miles from Birmingham and you've got another 5 miles to Stratford-on-Avon. And it tells you where the other aqueducts are, Yarningdale and Wootton Wawen. And as you continue along, you come to another one of these split bridges, and you get down towards Wilmcote. Wilmcote is quite an interesting spot for boaters because, of course, there is a good station there that enables them to get a train into Stratford. And therefore, British Waterways have put in a substantial number of moorings along the towpath here. And every time I've been there, they've invariably been well used. The next feature down the line is Wilmcote Bridge. Wilmcote Bridge was one of the original barriers to the restoration of the waterway, and was in fact one of the reasons why the British Transport Commission sought permission to abandon the canal. You can see from the right-hand picture that the bridge abutments had to be shored up with substantial wooden beams, but there was just sufficient room under those beams for the two canoes to get under with their tickets to prove that they had negotiated the waterway. The Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society have put on a very good interpretation board here, telling of the battle for Wilmcote Bridge and the way in which the canoe tickets helped to win that battle. But, you know, like most things, a lot of work had to be done, and in the end, the county council had to replace this old bridge with a new bridge. And here you see the new concrete span that was put in to replace that old metal bridge that went over the canal here. The embankment was shored up, and the whole area was improved when they put the new Wilmcote Bridge in. The Wilmcote Bridge is up here just before Wilmcote Station and provides the link road across from the village to the station itself. The canal continues along the top of the escarpment to Wilmcote Top Lock. And this is where the substantial Wilmcote flight of locks take you down virtually to the outskirts of Stratford-on-Avon. This is quite a substantial locks flight and goes down the whole of the escarpment to take the canal virtually into Stratford-on-Avon itself. At the top, you have got various buildings alongside the canal and a little reminder marker post that you are now 22 miles from King's Norton Junction. But of course, you go down the canal in the spring and it's quite wonderful to see the daffodils out on the banks and the primroses hiding under the bushes. It's an extremely attractive canal and is well looked after by the Stratford-on-Avon Canal Society and the Canal and River Trust. There is another one of the crossover bridges before you get to the top of the Wilmcote flight of locks. This is the top lock, and it's from here that you have to go down the escarpment to Stratford-on-Avon itself. The Wilmcote flight means that the locks come virtually one after the other all the way down the flight. A little bit of space between some, but not very much. It's hard work. But as you walk down, you can see in the spring the daffodils on the bank, and you can see how well maintained the towpath here, which is very regularly used by walkers and cyclists to go from Wilmcote Village down to Stratford-on-Avon. The canal itself has got the maintenance buildings rebuilt thanks to local volunteers, and this is the lengthsman's hut halfway down the flight that was rebuilt in 2015. And it's really the way in which the canal has been looked after under the careful supervision of the Society Preston Canal and River Trust to do these various works. The canal has bywashes past the locks, and often the water is cascading down, and it's quite a daunting place to work your boats because the lane here takes some vehicular traffic. Not very much, but there's a lot of cyclists go up and down here. But the canal continues on down the escarpment and down past the various bywashes that have been created alongside the locks to ensure the continuous water supply. And then you get to Wilmcote Bottom Lock, number 50, and this is the end of the flight, but not the end of the locks on the Stratford Canal. As you can see here, the towpath gets a bit muddy on occasions, particularly after showers of rain. Canal and River Trust have a workboat moored at the bottom of the flight so that people can put rubbish in, but more particularly they keep broken bits of lock gates there. But if you go down the canal in the spring, there is a profusion of flowers on the bushes alongside the towpath. And then you get to the outskirts of Stratford-on-Avon. And this is where the railway finally catches up with the canal. And this is where the railway line goes across the waterway to go into Stratford-on-Avon station. The railway line, as you see over on the left-hand side of the map, takes the railway over to Stratford-on-Avon station, which is the terminus for the line. And the canal then continues around the back of Stratford before coming in quietly into the basin at Stratford. The point being that the canal is rather secretive on its journey around Stratford and then comes into the basin with a big bang. The Stratford boat hire base is just beyond that railway bridge, and this is where Valley Cruisers have their hire boats, if you're thinking of hiring a boat on the Stratford Canal. But here you can see how the towpath in Stratford is very well maintained, and this makes all of the world of difference for an enjoyable walk. The problem is that the canal is skirting round the back of Stratford. There are a couple of offices and a hotel here, but for the most part, it just dips down underneath the road bridges and continues round the back of the town. The Stratford people look after the sides of the canal in the town, but don't necessarily maintain the quality of the towpath, which can get a bit muddy on occasions. But then it creeps round the back of a housing estate, and then after that reaches the point at which it ought to look for its junction with the River Avon. And beyond the lock that you see in the picture, the canal turns sharply round to go under a road bridge and then bends round to parallel that road to go into Bancroft Basin. The virtual situation is that you come out of a very quiet area and then you're bang in the centre of Stratford, and you've got the bridge with the main road over it, and beyond it is Stratford on Avon Basin with its various mooring pontoons. And this is where the lock is that takes you over to the River Avon. The waterways here, of course, have a dual purpose. Originally, the Stratford-on-Avon Canal was run by the National Trust, and the Avon navigation was reopened by the River Avon Navigation Trust. Now the canal is looked after by the Canal and River Trust, but they allow the Avon Navigation Trust to have a Stratford Waterways Information Centre here, where you can find out details and buy permits to go down the River Avon itself. The point is that the River Avon is quite a fickle river, and the levels can come up substantially. And here, beside the entry lock, is the standard navigation warning system of the red, the yellow and the green. If the water level outside the lock gate enables you to see the green, you know it's quite safe to go down the Avon. If the green is covered over by water, but you can still see the amber, then you can effectively proceed with caution. But if the amber is covered up, then don't go into the River Avon, because it will be very full and very dangerous. So here we have the means of getting to other places. You can go to Birmingham, to London, to York and to Liverpool from this point. And of course you can go out from the basin down into the River Avon itself. There is a nice mooring basin here in the centre of Stratford with a nice little park. And there is a little potted history of how the basin has developed over the years, and a little reminder on the map of the Stratford, Morton in the Marsh tramway that goes over a bridge here, and was part and parcel of the development of the transport infrastructure. The local trip boat operates from the basin out into the river, down the river, and brings people back into the basin itself. But of course, just beside the basin, there is a little sign to remind people that it was the National Trust that got the waterway restored. It used prisoners from Winston Green Jail in Birmingham and even prisoners from Wormwood Scrubs. And it was they who helped David Hutchins and his volunteers and others complete the restoration of the Southern Stratford Canal between 1961 and 1964. And a reminder that the canal was reopened here by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, on the 11th of July, 1964. A little sign marks that opening and the fact that it was carried out under the management of David Hutchins, MBE, who really masterminded the work on the Southern Stratford Canal. So we've started off at Lapworth Junction, and we've now ended up at Stratford-on-Avon. And this is where, if you wish, you can take a train back up to Lapworth if you so wish. Well, I hope that you found that the experience of a journey down the Stratford-on-Avon Canal has been interesting. It's a canal that has been brought back into life and is now pretty well maintained. There is still work to do, but for the most part, it is an enjoyable canal to boat along. Thank you very much for listening.
Roger, thank you very much for that fascinating tour down the Stratford-on-Avon Canal. We have time for a couple of questions. I'm going to kick off by asking you one, whilst the audience think of what their questions might be. You can put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom, audience, so please type them in and I'll ask Roger on your behalf. But my question was about the ownership that moved from the British Transport Commission to the National Trust, and then, somewhat surprisingly, I thought, back to British Waterways. Why did British Waterways want it back?
The point was that the National Trust were very persuasive through their chairman, John Smith, and the benevolence of a National Trust dowry to go back with the canal. And I think British Waterways saw the opportunity of seeing it as a vital link in the waterway system, and therefore felt that as it had been pretty well restored and a lot of money spent on it, it was going to be worthwhile them taking it back.
Jeremy Batch doesn't actually ask a question, but commends you and thanks you for your talk. Anybody else in the audience got a question? Well, I've got one other just to fill a little bit of time there. Well, not to fill time, but it is an interesting question. David Hutchins has been mentioned quite a lot, but I had a quick glance at Wikipedia while you were talking, and he doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, whereas the other main characters of the IWA in that era do. And I'm just wondering why is David Hutchins somewhat less famous than the others?
I think what you've got to appreciate is that some characters are quite abrasive and don't go out of the way to make friends. David Hutchins had a single mind and he was going to get the work done regardless. And he stood on a lot of toes to do it. And this meant that he didn't always have a lot of friends. But most people appreciated the work that he did. And that is why there is a plaque down at Stratford as a commendation of the work that he did to reopen the canal.
Well, maybe we should create that Wikipedia entry for him.
I think it would be a good thing. He did quite a lot of good work because he did some work on the Avon navigation. He started his canal restoration career by restoring the Wycombe Arm for the Coventry Boat Club just outside of Coventry. Then he cut his teeth on the Southern Stratford Canal. He got the arm on the canal, can't remember the name of the town, but the canal that goes to link in with the basin at Stourport. And he got an arm reopened there, and he generally helped people along the way in getting restorations underway.
It sounds to me like you have a short biography to write there, Roger, and maybe something to go in the Railway and Canal Historical Society journal.
Yeah.
Anybody else got any questions before we close? We are now just coming up to the normal finishing time of 9 o'clock. Anybody else want to type in a question? You can put it in the chat if that's quicker. If not, thank you very much, Roger, for your excellent talk and brilliant pictures. I know the sun always shines when you get your camera out. And you've obviously been to the Stratford Canal many times with that camera. So some really good photographs there and a very detailed picture of the history and the current state of the Stratford Canal that makes you want to go up there and hire one of those Black Prince boats. Was it Black Prince? Anyway, whoever's there.
Valley Cruisers.
Anyway, whoever they were. So thank you very much, Roger, for doing that.